I was intrigued by one of your footnotes, actually by all of the footnotes, but especially one where you say that you avoided using the phrase "the tip of the iceberg" because it would have been anachronistic at that time. Can you tell us a little more about how translating a contemporary book would differ from translating an older kind of classic book like this one, especially in terms of the language that you use?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Um, yeah, that was when I say historically situated, part of that was the annotations, the trying to bring this historical and cultural and social context to the fore as much as possible without making Brás into a textbook. And another part of it was trying to translate in as close proximity to this 19th century prose as possible. And that has to do with, we have this injustice that we're dealing with, that it's a book that only came into English 70 years after it was published. So he already arrives as a relic. He's doing all these modern, postmodern things, but he doesn't. If he'd, we can only think if Machado had arrived in English in the 1880s, what might he have done to the bloodstream of world literature? Um, but in order to understand, just as in order to understand the brilliance of the book, you have to understand and situate it in Brazil, in order to understand Machado's brilliance and how far ahead of his time he was. It has to sound like a 19th century book. That was one of my other principles. So one thing that when I did the sort of microscopic line by line comparative reading of the other translations, particularly Gregory Rabassa, he tends to cut up Machado's sentences to make it a little more dynamic. And that I hadn't done that in mind. I didn't really change anything as a result of this observation, but it sort of reinforced my conviction that you have to maintain that 19th century cadence, these long sentences. Um, I did a lot of work with 19th century dictionaries. In part it was like I'm in a PhD, I have time, I can mess around. So I bought as many, Portuguese to English dictionaries from as close to Machado's time period as I could. They were very cheap, people didn't want them. And whenever I was, sort of fiddling around for a word, playing around, I would go to them first. Because often, even if they were off the mark, they would give me it was like time travel. They would give me a flavor of something that I didn't know I was missing. When I would spend afternoons reading the dictionary and just sort of, they give you a measure of your ignorance because of the things that they felt were worth cataloging, the synonyms. And the Michaelis is actually a really wonderful, it became my favorite because and he had the Michaelis made a deliberate attempt to collect as many idiomatic phrases and sayings as possible. And some of them were just bizarre, like you'd have a Portuguese saying and she would suggest something in English that's like, no human being has ever said that. But I like it. Um, so I was sort of trying to immerse myself in the dictionaries of the time. I was reading as much 19th century English language literature as I could, especially I think the closest, um, not analog, but the writer that I kept coming back most to was Charles Lamb, who's actually quite a bit earlier than Machado. But the Essays of Elia really has a kinship with something in the prose, something in the very dry humor that he uses in Brás Cubas. And I always tried to, not, you know, embark on this impossible exercise of, I want to translate this as if I were in 1881, because that's just, that's a fantasy and an unhelpful one. But trying to not disturb the 19th century-ness of the book, to give readers that sense, and to essentially approach it as humbly as possible. Not only from a perspective of there are nuances of Portuguese that I might not be capturing, but there are nuances of this particular time that I might not be capturing. And so, when I was uncertain about something, not only going through all the old dictionaries, but going into the Hemeroteca Digital, looking at all Brazilian newspapers. I used the Corpus do Português, which is a Portuguese language linguistic corpus from BYU, which brings together, it has not only all of Machado's works, but many of his contemporaries. So I could see, I just have a feeling this word is strange. Now, is this Machado being strange? Is this a 19th century thing that's fallen out of fashion? Sometimes I would discover that, this particular combination of three words, the only time it appears in published Portuguese is right here on this page of Brás. So like I have the obligation to do something very strange here. And sometimes it would be, he's alluding to this political scandal. And so it's not meant to be indecipherable. It's meant to be decipherable. And so try to sort of work around it and make the joke clear without losing that context. So one review I think referred to, I don't remember if it was dusty or musty, my prose. And I don't think that was meant as a compliment, but it's like, yes. It's the smell of my dictionaries. Because, Machado, when you read him, he doesn't, and this is, I have to, every so often I go and speak in Brazilian schools about how fabulous I found Machado and how they have to, and they talk about how they have to get over this barrier of, it is very much, and it's a brilliant, extremely modern, postmodern, insane book, but in a late 19th century body. And so, in order for those two things, which are so they're both so intrinsic to the work to come through, I felt that I had to do as much as possible to maintain the text in that moment in time.